Greetings to everyone who is listening to us. The Integrative Health School asked me at a certain moment to participate in this project they have. It seemed to me that, given the circumstances, it would be interesting to talk about stress. But then I thought better of it, and alongside stress, there is another aspect, which is the whole topic of mental protection and resilience, which is talked about less and is usually cited and explained less. I do not intend to summarize in half an hour so that you can draw complete conclusions, but rather to provide a series of insights. That, along with some bibliographic references, will allow you to advance in this field of study at a certain moment. A field of study that, by the way, has two characteristics. First, it is a recent field of study, practically starting from the 1950s, when the phenomenon of resilience began to be studied more intensively. And the second is a fact, a quality that has been known for a long time, that there is a group of people who are capable of enduring and overcoming adversities in a much more efficient way than others, and of whom a quality has always been considered in all cultures, whether ancient, modern, Western, or Eastern. We have various images there. These images evoke the beginning of stress studies, post-traumatic stress, practically linked to the return of soldiers from World War I. Soldiers who on the front could have had crises, neurosis crises, what was called war neurosis, can be seen in the lower left image, resulting from a war effort that had not been observed until that moment. We are talking about World War I, we are talking about trench fields, we are talking about the use of weapons of mass destruction, the use of lethal gases that were later banned by the Vienna Convention. We are talking about the concept of total war, where there were no fronts. And we are talking, among other things, about a battle like the one at the Somme in France, on French territory, where in that single battle, more than 500,000 people died, of all kinds. We are talking about true massacres. So in that phenomenon, in that scenario, many people found themselves trapped in an authentically mental block that intensified when they returned from the front. That phenomenon, that set of emotional reactions of psychic and psychiatric conditions, caused limitations that were sometimes total and was defined as post-traumatic stress, stress of gain. There are some other figures there that reference these violent events, such as Goya's paintings of war. You can also see in the upper left an old image of Sigmund Freud with two soldiers from the front. Sigmund Freud was one of the first, as we will see later, to start studying this phenomenon of both stress and resilience in the subsequent studies that followed. Talking about stress is talking about Seda. Seda in the 1930s was interested in the pathophysiological effects of stress. He begins to carefully analyze them there. With his laboratory rats, he subjected them to a series of stressful phenomena, observed their reactions, autopsied them, and analyzed how stress affected their organs. All of that began to take the first steps towards recognizing how stress caused real injuries, often permanent, in the cardiovascular system, the endocrine system, and also in the central nervous system, in the brain. You already know that stress comes from a concept in physics of load, of force, of how much force a material can withstand. And from there, it was transferred to the study of physiology and medicine. Faioli also involves the concept of general adaptation syndrome. That is to say, there is a balance. It is true that a balance can occur in the organism in response to a stress phenomenon. There is a part of stress that can be positive. It is that part of the first part of the curve, which makes stress a stimulus for growth. But there is a phase of that stress, which is the last part of the curve, that phase of exhaustion, where a prolonged period of constant stress, whether acute or chronic, on certain individuals, simply leads to a breakdown to exhaustion, where their underground capsules can no longer assimilate more, where their psychological reactions can no longer assimilate more, and therefore the person breaks down and enters a severe physical and also emotional breakdown. I recommend a book, a recent book, from this Korean philosopher who lives in Germany, who teaches philosophy in Germany, Will Chulhan, The Burnout Society. It is a small book from Harvard University Press. Chulhan discusses at this moment the phenomenon of chronic stress in a society that is ours, which is too demanding, that demands from us and has also made us believe, the vast majority of people, that it is necessary to work hard, to strive a lot, just to accumulate. We accumulate in an illogical way, in a false way, in a theatricalized way. It is a stance, a way of posturing, where perhaps the most notable example is the position that some people adopt on social media, where they try to share a life or create a parallel life that does not exist. This phenomenon is what he explains very well. And as he points out, at this moment, fatigue, exhaustion, is the reflection of this society in the same way as tuberculosis, leprosy, or the plague. It was the respect of other societies. I highly recommend reading this book. It is known that stress can already cause. It is linked to numerous things. Cases of premature aging, of course, the development of accidents. There are many traffic accidents that have been studied and analyzed, linked to stress cases, workplace accidents that are well known, phenomena of sleep disorders, insomnia, immunological conditions, cardiovascular diseases, many skin diseases, psoriasis, dermatitis, eczema, and shingles, all of which are linked to many situations. It is advisable to ask patients why they relate that phenomenon when they relate it in time, because from there, many very interesting conclusions can be drawn. There are a series of diagrams showing the relationship of stress with other diseases. We could add a few more. And there I show you a part of the brain that is very interesting, a region of the hypothalamus, a region of the hippocampus, which is an area where cortisol, when secreted chronically, affects and also manages. These lesions that appeared in Shady's laboratory rats have been found to be identical or very similar to those found in Alzheimer's patients. So, Alzheimer's disease, besides being considered an inflammatory disease today, is also linked in many cases to a long period of stress, chronic stress, which damages certain brain areas, among which are mainly these areas of the hippocampus. The question this slide asks is whether you know the so-called disease of leisure. The disease of leisure is one that arises during the weekend. You will find, if you are therapists, patients who will tell you that their migraines always occur on weekends, or that their insomnia problems always happen on weekends, or that their gastrointestinal problems occur just when they go on vacation, or that an asthma crisis appears precisely when it shouldn't. That is the response of a body that weakens and gives in. After weeks of maintaining tension, of enduring tension, of pulling the body, there comes a moment when, at the moment of rest, when one stops, withdrawing from effort, that is when the illness appears, when herpes simplex appears, when an asthma crisis or flu crisis appears, when the dermatological condition appears. We are talking about the connections as they emerged in the 1930s of the so-called psychoneuroimmunology. Immunology, central nervous system, hormonal system, are interconnected. They have common receptors, they have common connection pathways in a phenomenon that is interesting and fascinating for study. Can acute and chronic stress cause changes in the penises and also be transmitted to the next generation? This is what this slide presents to us. Yes, it seems to be so. Through epigenetic mechanisms that shape the response to stress. Studies have already been conducted on several litters of mice where the so-called epigenetic vulnerability has been proven. These modifications that occur in the genes can affect not only the individual impacted by the CRISES phenomenon, but also subsequent generations. It is a debate that is currently opening up as it needs to be studied, since there is a part that is learned. It is well known that anxious children are often linked to the observation of anxious behaviors in mothers. The child, especially the young child, lives around the mother, lives around the behavior of the mother or the father. If the mother or father or their close ones live in conditions of permanent anxiety, he perceives that situation and is somehow overwhelmed. How will that influence him when he becomes an adult or when he passes on a certain way of acting to his children? It is something that is being debated, whether it is a behavioral part, which surely influences, but also if there is a marked genetic imprint in this phenomenon of the relationship between genes and ways of acting being the emotional part. All of this is related to new specialties that arise. You know that science advances largely when two of them interrelate, when they relate and create a new one. This is the case of psychoneuroimmunology. It is the case of psychoneurodermatology. It is the study of how that permanent stress diminishes the immune response and how the immune system, as we discussed earlier, and the central nervous system, but also the endocrine system are related. It is already known that in the face of certain threats, heart rate is altered, respiratory rate, insulin levels, blood glucose levels. There is even a decrease in pain sensitivity. Pro-inflammatory mechanisms develop, mechanisms for the release of lymphokines develop, and there you see the regulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is so important for all these studies, and of course, the two major arms of the immune system's response, the Th1 form, the Th2 form. It is impossible right now to explain all of this in detail because all of this is practically a world, right? But it is there, and we can return at another time to study it or analyze it. I simply give you this slide to demonstrate the complexity of all these factors. Notice the influence responses there, such as the fact that pregnancy practically stimulates interleukin-4, among other things. How the Th1 and Th2 response is influenced by so many factors, where in the end there will be an adequate, regulated, defined, controlled immune response, which is very important, controlled. After there is a response, there is control. Otherwise, that self-perpetuation of the immune response leads to a phenomenon of autoimmunity, or, as we have been seeing recently, to a phenomenon that we have seen in COVID-19 in certain patients who enter an immune crisis that is difficult to resolve and that already involves the hematological system, the central nervous system, the cardiovascular system, in a chain of events that are then difficult to control. Thank you. More than half of those admitted during previous crises due to other life-threatening conditions, such as SARS in 2003, experienced psychological effects. That phenomenon of post-traumatic stress, having been close to very serious situations, having seen, as some say, face-to-face with death, can lead to emotional conditions that may persist for a long time. And the most vulnerable to all of this are known to be healthcare workers who are exposed to constant stress from very seriously ill patients, the sick, and especially those patients who have lost a family member due to their illness. Therefore, we not only have to address all these conditions from a strictly biological point of view, but also assess the post factors of the post. COVID, as is already being discussed, should be seen as phenomena that are not only biological but also psychosocial in nature, since there will be and a mental crisis will occur, with a higher incidence of anxiety, depression, increased domestic violence, and greater incidence of drug and alcohol use. The economy will possibly sooner or later recover, more or less, but the question that needs to be asked is whether lives will also recover in the same way. Notice that the economic crisis of 2008-2009 resulted in an 18% increase in cases of depression, and it also increased cases of anxiety and alcohol abuse. What is the risk of all this? The risk is simply to psychiatric patients. We cannot only psychiatric patients. Psychiatric means to medicalize and put them in a response exclusively based on medication. It does not require another type of action from a psychotherapeutic point of view, from the perspective of social networks, which are very important. Stress and its actions, its effects, the effects nowadays in the face of situations, much less dramatic, far less dramatic than even what we are experiencing today. Sometimes I've heard historical comparisons. They have nothing to do with it, not even remotely. We are not aware of what our grandparents, our great-grandparents, went through in the first part of the 20th century, with 2 terrible world wars, with a civil war like the Spanish one. We do not know it. And yes, we are closer today to what are called stressful life events. Simply the act of living, divorce, the death of a family member, the death of a child, the stress of being a mother or father, moving homes, generates a series of stressful stimuli that often in a comfortable society like ours seem like worlds and create tensions for us. Well, in light of this situation, Lazarus, a psychologist from the University of California, offered an integrative approach to solutions. He said that in the face of a crisis, one should not remain exclusively in emotion. If one remains in the emotion perpetuates itself. The emotion reminds one of the situation, brings it back to mind. What people usually say is that they are always going around in circles about the same issue. So, that is of no use. One should not focus on emotion. It is necessary to try to get people to focus on acting. One must act in response to and solve, act in the face of the crisis, in the face of the life event and stressor, and not solely be overcome by emotion. We are vulnerable and our immune system can be affected. We have seen that it is true. We also know that the children's immune system is very vulnerable to psychological burdens, but at the same time, it has been studied that children have a great capacity for resilience and that both optimism and good humor contribute to an ideal outlook of life, reinforce the phenomenon of resistance, the phenomenon of resilience, and will protect the brain, the heart, and our immune system in the long term. Combating stress, making a positive adaptation, that phenomenon which is part of a whole, has been termed under the concept of resilience, a concept that began to be studied in earnest since the 1950s, and that from an etymological point of view, it has the expression of backward leaving, jumping backward. It means to return once again, to reconnect with ourselves and to establish new goals. Therefore, resilience must be understood from a neurobiological perspective, but also from a psychological one, as a phenomenon that is very complex to study and that needs to be worked on. In 1917, Sigmund Freud wrote about the so-called work of mourning, a process that he described, he said, to recover libido understood as emotional energy, which has nothing to do with sexual matters, as it has always been attributed, in order to recover emotional energy after the loss of an object, an emotion, whether real or created or imagined, which is also a very important phenomenon regarding what we imagine and the realities that actually are. From all the studies that have been conducted looking, as always from a biological point of view, for mechanisms involved, In the phenomenon of resilience, we can say that there have been many. Substances such as hydroelectric and androsterone, pregnenolone, oxytocin, the determined neuropeptides, or at the time other proteins like those that Eric Nestler from Mount Sinai pointed out in 2010, that his mice exhibited as a tool against distress, have been sought to find chemical substances that could later contribute to the pharmacological arsenal, as if it was so easy to take a pill or get an injection, and that it would endow us with the capacity for resilience. What is known is that, according to Bonanno's studies in the 90s, it is more people than is normally believed overcome severe stress situations, strong wounds, and that often they do not need much time to recover. With what he proposed, the ideal of Freudian mourning did not seem so real. It has always been pointed out that mourning, like the crisis of falling in love, should not last more than a year due to this phenomenon. Modern versions of the so-called emotional grief would therefore be much shorter than believed and much quicker than normally thought, which is certainly an advantage. Neuropsychological studies have discovered the human capacity to overcome very cruel and dramatic events. We are talking about truly historical and dramatic situations. And it is also known that, we say again, it usually happens in a very short time, and that people can almost seem to have come out almost intact. These processes, healing processes, natural ones, coincide. Genetically, of course, biochemically, but also psychology, anthropology, behavior, and social networks. Social networks are very important for overcoming events. People who have friends, who have family, who have travel companions, life companions, overcome much better than those who are isolated or alone. This is something that often makes a difference. It has been established what characteristics a person with greater resilience might have, and they have some, right? Their ability to collaborate, to resolve issues, the fact that they sleep well or take care of themselves, the fact that they have a goal in life, or if they don't have one, they create it, right? They are important. It seems to come from a creative inner world, which is always a refuge. Certainly the supportive social networks we have talked about. People who tend to ask for help, who are not constantly complaining in a trivial way, who look to the future, who use humor as a protective tool against adverse circumstances, who generate what has been called emotional intelligence, and those people who also recognize and appreciate with gratitude the positive events that are around them. Today, many instruments have been sought that could develop or manage resilience. I have provided one for you, the practice of meditation, but also the practice of yoga. There is talk of psychoanalysis, periods of rest, and therapeutic forest baths, for example, which are very interesting studies conducted in Japan. And as we talk about humor within, the instruments of resilience, here I give you an example that you have surely encountered more than once in your consultations. Like when someone with stress asks you to quickly solve their problem because they have very little time. When talking about resilience, we must also talk about this man, Viktor Frankl. He has a book called Man's Search for Meaning. I also recommend that you read it. He survived a concentration camp for 2 years. 3 years, I believe, he was in the Nazi concentration camps and came out alive. After that experience, which we can obviously think was very tough, he became a psychiatrist. And here, I take them, and he has a work that I highly recommend reading, Man's Search for Meaning, to understand how someone who has gone through a truly traumatic event can rebuild their life. These images are terrible, but he could have shown others that are not closer, such as the one of the refugees who are currently fleeing the war in Syria, or that of any other human group that we sometimes see in a sketch on television. When a man, a human being, is subjected to such a degree of depression and such a level of stress, the ability to move forward is, as we pointed out at the beginning, a highly valued instrument, highly valued in all our societies. Thank you, and, well, work on resilience. I hope this has helped you become interested and to study and analyze this phenomenon more, which, I insist, is still in the research phase. Best regards.